Okay. Thank you so much to all of you at Olesias, great new venture, and to all of you watching. Thanks for showing up on a Saturday to do something special like this. It is a very warm and wonderful topic that warms our hearts, really, when we think about music and rhythm and how it can affect the brain. I think it's one of the most fascinating topics, and it's in fact been something that's been around since the beginning of time. So today I hope to share with you insight into the deeper workings of rhythm and how it produces something called entrainment, and how this process of entrainment actually affects both the brain and the central nervous system. And I will speak to you on the next seminar that we have planned in December on brain disorders, a little bit more about 2 specific case studies. So if you'd like to join me there, that would be really great. Gazelle, perhaps a tech issue, maybe you could just isolate one video, because when I try that, it just gets a black box, I think, with your name in it. So that way I could also have a video screen while we are presenting. So welcome to all of you. My name is Helen, as you heard, Argyrou. My nickname is Helenique because there's so many Helens where I live. So sometimes I have a gathering at a picnic place and people say Helen, and then 7 women turn around. So they gave me this nickname, Helenique. And I have a website that helps you pronounce my name better. So you can just say Helen Aha. If you don't want to say the whole Argyrou part, you can just say Aha. And Aha was something I developed as a word to explain some of these very fascinating findings that came out of my experience as a drummer and as a musician, playing percussion for about 20 years now. The last 10 or 15, I used it as a drum therapist or a drummer, using it for education and for transformational purposes, both on personal development levels and then also to assist people in my clinical practice who needed some supplementation besides psychotherapy. So I'm a clinical psychologist, trained in Africa, working now in Cyprus, and having put drum work around 13 countries around the world. And I've seen it working in many different ways with many different people for many different reasons. And then came across a very special place in America called the Rhythmic Entrainment Institute, run by a man called Jeffrey Strong, who did some really interesting research, which I'll be sharing with you in the coming seminars and webinars. And so today we're going to be talking about rhythmic healing, the specific part of music that's rhythm. Is very much about frequency of beats. It's not about melody so much. It's not about the wave of the sound, wave of the music. It's about the frequency of the beats. And this creates a very transformational process. And this process is called entrainment. Entrainment didn't start with drumming and music. It actually started as a study many, many years ago. And it's been shown in the literature that entrainment actually is something that changes biological rhythms of the body. And it's been documented, as I said, in many places. We've studied respiration and heart rates, which can be entrained by sound. For example, we've also got motor movements, the movement of the body that can be entrained by an auditory stimulus. And we've also got subtle body movements that you will do every single day when you talk to your friends, unconsciously mapping, synchronizing their body language with yours. And this is what we call social skills, right? So we are always watching each other based on a principle very similar to entrainment and mirroring each other. There's a fascinating part of the brain called mirror neurons that I can talk to you about at some other point, but it also is part of what gets facilitated in this process. So we know that sound, auditory stimuli, can actually then entrain the body. What do we mean exactly by entrain? Well, we mean it actually affects the auditory listening system. So both the brain, the body, the whole central nervous system is connected to the brain. So through the ears, you'll get stimulated to the brain and then down into the body. And we call that auditory driving. Now, auditory driving research was found to have a direct relationship between speed. I don't know if you can see this, Gazelle, but this is what I mean. If you could just have one video, then I could actually read the slide, but maybe I'll just have to turn the video off then if we do that. Yeah, there you go. It's better. So auditory driving actually is a relationship between then the speed and the rhythm that's played, the speed of the rhythm. And we can also see the repetition of the rhythm itself is also affecting the way the brain is receiving that information. Now, Many of you might know this. If you don't, quick recap, named after the Greek alphabet. I happen to be in a Greek island called Cyprus, so this is quite familiar for me. We've got alpha, brainwave frequency, which is one of the slowest, but not by far the slowest, but it's much slower than this beta brainwave that you can see over here. Alpha is really the optimal state of focus and relaxation. It's where we feel physically and emotionally relaxed. The rhythmic entrainment process I'm going to be sharing with you today is a process that is working to produce alpha for long periods of time, for 30 minutes a day, for about 4 months. That's about 12 repetitions of 2-week intervals. We are driving the brain into its most optimal way of getting into alpha by using rhythmic sound. And as you see here, when you go into sleep, you're at the slowest, where the body is no longer responding, but the body is repairing itself. Theta, a whole nother conversation about how do we drive theta brainwave states. But really with rhythm, we know that we can drive alpha very, very easily. And at certain points, we can drive theta, depending on the rhythm and the state of mind. Gamma is what we see in most meditators. Some of you are from India, so you'll know this very well. Your meditators, your rishis, your sages, seers of ancient times, would have very specific practices to elevate more and more gamma brainwaves. We know that monks have very high gamma brainwaves, but most of us are spending our time here in beta. You see that there's a much more fast cycling brainwave frequency here, much electricity in the body-brain system. And we've got all this alert consciousness, thinking mind, excitement, adrenaline, cortisol running through the body. And unfortunately, ladies and gentlemen, many people with neurological disorders have a difficult time producing and maintaining these alpha brainwaves. What's more is anybody who is actually using a device or using technology will also struggle to produce enough alpha, because what's starting to happen is devices are actually training us to get our alpha from the device and no longer on our own. And this becomes somewhat of a problem, because it means that we are now becoming reliant on having alpha come into our bodies when we are scrolling through the internet or when we are working with a device. And now you see most children in shopping centers, when their parents are going out to buy their groceries, they have a little iPad in front of them. So people are learning to regulate their brainwaves through technology and no longer through the normal, organic, natural ways that we would get alpha. Now, you might ask, what is that? What are the normal ways to go into alpha? Well, we used to have a lot of it. Nature, pets, animals living around us. Animals are more in alpha than they are anywhere else. Lots of kind of specific calming and soothing practices from maybe a mother that's very relaxed, or a mother who's singing lullabies to you as a child, or playing with other kids and being very calm and singing. We don't really have this oral tradition moving through our lives anymore. We don't have a lot of wild animals, near us anymore. We don't really have an environment of nature with no electrical light and no stimulation. What we have is hyper-stimulated environments around us every single day. So we are losing touch with alpha frequency. Now, what drumming or rhythm or an auditory driving process really is doing is it sets up a rhythmic sequence of beats. And then if you were to imagine this big blue ball, the bright blue ball, the dark blue ball being the brain, and the other pendulum balls here, the light blue ones, being the body system, the body-mind system, all in unison here. We've got this brain trying to follow a certain kind of stimulus. So now let's flip it around and let's imagine that this blue dark ball is the sound, the rhythmic sound. And this is the influencing factor that's happening through your body, your brain, your nervous system, your organs, the rest of your body. And you start to produce a rhythmic sound over here. What starts to happen is it starts to influence all the sky blue balls, and they actually go in conflict with the strong blue ball. So they kind of hit against each other for a while until they have even less friction and conflict. So they are hitting each other a little bit less dynamically. And before you know it, they start actually coming together more, and they start to swing in unison, all together synchronized. This is called entrainment. It's actually a scientific phenomenon. It's in fact being studied, as we've just said, in multiple ways. And we know now that rhythm can actually do that. And when it's doing that, it's actually affecting the whole system. So from the brain that's listening to the sound, trying to synchronize with it, but at first being in conflict with the sound, the brain eventually has to start to choose a preferential process. Am I going to listen to the sound, or am I going to focus on something else? And it oscillates between listening to the sound, but because it's rhythmic, percussive sound, it's quite complex and quite difficult to follow. So it kind of gets a little confused and maybe gets frustrated, maybe gets hyperstimulated, and then calms down and focuses on something else. And then it oscillates between these 2 points of attention regularly enough to start to go in a synchronized unison with this swinging of the pendulum all together, meaning that the brain, body, mind system, the whole central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system starts to synchronize to the rhythmic sound. This is a very profound process that's been totally overlooked. It's in fact always been around, because from the beginning of time, we've seen ancient civilizations using drum and percussive sound. In fact, we know that there was an auditory stimulus being produced in tribal cultures where there were shamans in the forest, or there were, rituals in many cultures that were using drumming and the contact of two hitting sticks, or claves, we call them, which was the first way to create percussive sound. And this was a way that the tribe would get together, commune, connect, and go into a rhythmic synchronized state. And dancing would happen, some movement, some singing. And this whole process creates a certain kind of synchronization between brain and body. And then, of course, also between all the people in the group. And so you see when people play music, that's happening. But when we have rhythmic sound on its own, it's working the same way, but even deeper. In fact, drummers call that a primary pulse. And they believe they can even connect with the universal pulse of the vibrational field, that there is a pulsating sensation with the planet every single second. We've now studied this, and we've seen that clinical studies actually show reductions in anxiety and anxiety-based behaviors based on the principle of entrainment using rhythmic sound. And I introduce you now to my colleagues at the Strong Institute, where they started their first clinical studies in '94, subsidized by the Autism Foundation, the Autism Association in America, and they were studying different autistic spectrum samples and found that people with autism were a great sample to study because they have a lot of anxiety, they have meltdowns, they struggle very much in regulating emotion, in contact sometimes with other people, and it sometimes gets very challenging. So we have a very interesting example then in studying autistic spectrum, because we see that with rhythmic sound, we can actually go beyond this placebo effect, because autistic spectrum participants don't know necessarily that they're being tested, or that there's a certain noise that's there to try and produce stimulation to measure their symptoms and whether they will be reducing. So we don't have this interference in the research. And of course, it was very interesting to have this as the initial sample, because it was a very good way to look at agitation and anxiety, because there's a very specific amount of it, all the way from aggressive behavior, tantrums, as I mentioned, and, overstimulation affecting those two things. We know then that, if we saw results in this spectrum of participants, then there would be some basis for further research. Now, what we did see is that the tantruming and the social engagement vastly improves when we play certain percussive rhythmic samples to this particular population group. Children between 6 to 12 years were tracked regarding their immediate anxiety reducing effects, as well as the long-term changes in their anxiety levels. And this was after a program of very specific rhythmic sound, and listening to the rhythmic entrainment intervention rhythms that were aimed to reduce the anxiety, which would probably end up in a tantrum, for example. They had some marked positive results. Now, initially, just the residual calming effect was there, but there were also very high significant levels of that. 86 to 86.4% of people in the samples had reduced anxiety and whatever symptomology or behavior goes with that in that particular case. Significant changes in average anxiety went from 82 out of 100 to 38 when the REI rhythms were played quietly in the background over an 8-week period. Here we see a very interesting scale of different indicators. We can see that there's an overall anxiety pattern that's changing. There's aggressive behavior that's lessening, and there is the effects of the rhythmic sound actually producing marked changes in aggressive behavior, tantrums, where, you know, even one resident was extremely aggressive before the study began, often injuring other residents or the staff several times per week. Within 2 weeks of listening, aggressive outbursts virtually stopped, and they remained rare for the entire study period, an extended follow-up for 6 months. Now, this is one case, but we have many, many examples of very specific cases having very specific reductions. Significant reduction in anxiety-based behaviors while listening to the REI are also producing a reduced amount of emotional outbursts, generalized anxiety, self-stimulating behaviors, where, you know, you often have people on the spectrum might, you know, do a repeated action over and over to try and calm down the stimulation inside the body. And we see that lessening, aggressive behavior, and also sensitivity to sound. Now, this is the baseline for the work. Many samples were then studied after that, from chronic pain to general anxiety. And of course, then, since then, this institute has trained many, many case workers who are able to use the system in multiple and varying ways. And I myself have actually used the system, a home program, I'll explain more about it, in a variety of my clients in my clinical practice who I knew would need some supplementary support. So I was doing the psychotherapy with them, but I could see they still had so much cortisol, adrenaline, or maybe the wave that we see in depression happening from, you know, loss of motivation all the way up to being very anxious. And they needed more support, so I would put them on the program. And I've done that with somebody with epilepsy, somebody who had a brain shaft inserted, clients who've had anxiety over the time, and PTSD, ADHD and ADD. We don't really mind which version it is because we're not looking at diagnosis. We look at symptoms. People who had generally behavioral problems, depression. I've treated children with autism. And then I've also tested it with schizophrenia, which had an autism comorbidity, somewhat of a difficult case to diagnose. In all of these, except for the schizophrenia client, we have seen marked reduction in symptoms. Why? Because the sound is actually helping to integrate the sensory system. It calms and soothes the central nervous system by actually training the brain to produce alpha. And there's a whole scientific phenomenon behind that, which I can go into detail about if we have time. And if you want to ask a question about it, I can explain more. But really what's happening is we are inducing the alpha brainwave frequency following a sequence of 6 to 8 beats per second. This has been tested in all this research, and it's normally produced every 2 weeks to optimize that particular person's profile of behavior based on feedback we get from the person. And it's played for 30 minutes per day, 5 times a week for 16 weeks. And normally we suggest it to be on what we call sub-volume, which means not loud enough to irritate you and not soft enough to not be heard. and it needs to be customized. This is one of the winning ingredients of this program, because many sound and medicine type music systems exist, but they are very generic. They tend to follow this general rule that everybody that has, let's say, depression would respond in the same way, which is definitely not true. We are seeing very customized profiles of behavioral change and behavioral stress that people have. So of course, you know, it's not so one size fits all. So now we have a quick dive into alpha. And as you can see here, there are some very interesting facts about how alpha brainwave is being produced. I want to let you read that for a moment. And as you can see, the second point refers to all of us, where we started this presentation, is that herein lies the key to the future of health optimization. Since many of us are post-COVID, possibly struggling with neurobiological degenerative possibilities on the level of brain health, there is very specific things we need to be rethinking in terms of health optimization. We are all facing the reduction of alpha brainwave frequency, and we need to work harder to produce it. But what if we do have systems from ancient indigenous knowledge systems and current technology that can work together to produce access for people to have certain audios that will help them entrain the brain to return back to higher alpha frequencies? And if we have music medicine that is actually created to be optimal because it's using natural sound and not electronic sound, then we still keep ourselves in touch and in sync with these profound systems of self-organization. Since many of us are using technology, we also need to confront the fact that we will need to work harder to stay healthy. We will need to find ways to be much more calm and relaxed as our world becomes even more hyper-stimulated. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we have programs through the Rhythmic and Entrainment Institute that also optimizes health for peak performance and people who are not suffering with symptoms, but actually just takes them into higher performance. So I encourage you all to find out more, if you like, from any of the following here. You can find me on LinkedIn. Just follow me there. I have a lot of content about neuroscience and how it affects performance. And then I have a website that will start to feature a little bit more information about drumming specifically, but also entrainment and sound vibration. You know, NAD yoga is an excellent example, evidence-based, of how sound, rhythm, vibration absolutely affects our body-mind system. And I have many projects running on integrative health, one coming up in Dubai, which is giving awards to women who have generated new health solutions for integrative health. So we do need to be looking at brain-body systems, no longer just considering the brain as a separate organ, but how it affects the entire body, and treat all kinds of medical diagnoses in a more integrative, holistic way. And then on YouTube, I have a channel there called Aha Intelligence, and I did hint at the fact that Aha actually is a great symbolic way of understanding that we have two hemispheres, the right and the left, and more holistic, integrative practices that actually get both sides of the brain working are needed in order to create more balance in us as human beings. You know, many of us are writing with the right hand and not doing much with the left, and therefore becoming a little unbalanced in the way our whole system works. So we do need to think of new experiential learning practices, more a merger between science and spirit, a merger between art and science, to create more holistic, ways of understanding the world. And then for all of you on the call, I have a special gift. If you hop on over to my LinkedIn profile, I have an article there on rhythmic entrainment. And it's hyperlinked over here, but I can always send it to OLCS if they want to forward it to the delegates at this seminar. And if you like and comment on that article, I will have a way to find you on LinkedIn and then actually send you a little sample of REI, calming or energy boosting gift audio from me. And if you want to refer clients to me for any reason or want to know more about it, I will also be giving you a gift for that as well, because I think this is a very helpful piece of information for a lot of families out there that might be really struggling with special needs and don't know what they can do. We've seen vast improvements in family harmony using REI because it's a home program, it's non-invasive. Kids find it quite cool to be listening to music, and parents feel very comforted to know that they can see symptoms reducing. I want to thank you all for your attention. I'm open to some questions, and I look forward to doing more presentations with all of you and learning more about you and your needs as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Helen. You really intrigued us with the idea that how brain can be trained with some music. Yeah, that was the idea, and it was perfect.
Yes, thank you.
So let me ask if any of one present here are having any questions or would like to discuss anything with Helen. And one more thing, Helen, in case you would like to share your links, which you just show us on the screen, please share it on our chat box also, so that everyone can go through it.
Sure.
Thank you so much. Till then,
yes.
The attendees, anything you would like to discuss with Helen? Yeah, it's
yes.
Fawad. Mr. Fawad, please go ahead with the question.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Helen, for your presentation. I have one question because you mentioned in different disorders of neurological disorders, you used such a rhythmic sound and all of them shows beneficial effects. My question is because each neurological disorder has a specific system, for example, cholinergic system, or it can be, for example, other types of system involved. How is it specific pathogenesis, or in the result, in the end, it has the same effect on all of them?
Yeah,
and how,
this is a very good question. Yeah, because this is exactly what I meant when I said the special ingredient is that it's customized. So before somebody starts the program, they answer about 147 questions. We have managed to reduce that, but the questionnaire is really to understand the symptomology. We're not interested in the diagnosis. We're interested in symptoms, behavior. So we look at the severity, the frequency, the consistency, and the duration of symptoms. And then from that symptom panel, we then start off with a certain rhythm. And what we find is that most symptoms are driven by a certain amount of agitation in the unconscious mind and a certain amount of agitation and overstimulation or understimulation in the nervous system. So different diagnoses are operating in that way because they have different effects through the central nervous system. But the premise remains that there is agitation of some kind. And this, I guess, is where the true science comes in, and you would know more if you're in the medical field than I do about all this. So we're not so interested in the diagnosis. We're not so interested in how it's the same as everything else. We're interested in this unique person, what behavior they have, whether they sleep well, whether they fight, whether they, are temper tantruming, are they very defiant, things that are indicating behavioral struggles that they have, symptoms. And we treat all kinds of age groups. So my sample next time is going to be on a man who's over 70 with epilepsy, and then another young man who was in his mid-30s who had a brain shaft inserted. We customize the program. After every 2 weeks, we measure behavior with an online questionnaire, and then the rhythm sample changes. If you ever heard of the famous Pythagoras, he had a system of understanding sound and how it affects the body, very similar to the one that we are kind of proposing here, and understanding that the body is entirely affected by over production of stimuli or an underproduction of stimuli and how the body processes it. So we are actually affecting the symptoms so far as they can be reduced by calming down the nervous system and keeping the alpha quota high, optimal, and consistent. And that's how the system is working. So it's not the same for every single person. We can never promise results. In fact, we under-promise so we can over-deliver, because it's a customized journey, and we need to see how much can we tune this body's system, this person's body and their system, with a specific sound frequency of beats that's going to get them to their optimal alpha. And then we go on a journey to see how that works. And what we find is some very statistically relevant results. Did that answer your question?
Yes, but also I have another question. Because usually the drugs or other things that they use for neurological disorders, the effects of those things that they use, it stays for a long time, because it's going to change, for example, receptors or the microenvironment of the brain and the neurons. So these small effects that you are putting inside the brain and in the microenvironment, how much they can stay after if they stop using these sounds or stop, or is there any result it can stay after this or no?
Yeah, these are all long-term results. We have other programs that are for a transitional period, which work for only 6 hours. So if you listen to a great piece of music, you'll feel calm while you're listening. You listen to a specific REI designed rhythmic sequence, you're talking about 6 to 8 beats per second. That's a very specific level of simulation. When you hear tabla in Indian, the ragas, it's all built in, right? This is not new, but the way that we are scientifically measuring it is, and the way we are using it and inducing it, is percussive sound. So there's a real deep science in percussive sound. It's very different to a chemical that is put into the body, that is induced outside of the body and then put into the body, and then the body keeps the remnants of that. So let's remember that's a chemical compound. Sound is not a chemical compound. It's not matter. It's a wave. And so it's affecting the brain-body system for a period of time to train the body internally to use its own natural intelligence to create alpha, and then to sustain the practice of that alpha every time it gets re-triggered every night for 16 weeks or for 4 months. You are training the body to begin to produce the alpha from within. And then you don't need the sound to do it, because the body started learning to do it by itself. You have long-term effects. However, when the child or the person hits the next crisis or goes through the next developmental cycle, they will start to have challenges again. The symptoms might increase, and then we have to do a top-up, or we maybe can play the last sample of audio that was the optimal audio to get them to a higher level of functioning once again. So it's a very profound thing, and it's amazing that we've had this around on the planet all along. But because our accelerated modern life has taken us so far away from our natural systems, we've now started needing to use external things to try and regulate. But actually, with this, we are teaching the body to return to its natural wisdom to self-regulate. And it's true that you have limits to that, because certain people have very serious conditions and very serious symptoms. That's why we don't treat psychosis with this. Psychosis is more complex. Bipolar disorder will have certain, reduction in symptom, but other things will stay there. We don't claim to cure disease. We are working on reducing symptoms. And if we can do it non-invasively, we absolutely defend that, because we don't need more chemical toxicity in the body than is necessary.
Thank you, Helen.
Thank you too.
Thank you for the question, Mr.